Joining us now from Tel Aviv is political analyst Dahlia Scheindlin. She is a fellow at the Century Foundation who has consulted on Israeli political campaigns. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So voting for Israel's fifth election in less than 4 years is now underway, and we could very well see the return of Benjamin Netanyahu despite his corruption charges. How likely is a Netanyahu comeback, do you think? And if he's able to pull that off, what would his coalition government look like if he has to reach out inevitably to the far right?
I think of all the various scenarios, it is certainly one of the more likely scenarios that we have in place right now. And that's because Netanyahu has basically four parties, including his own and three others, who are very loyal to him and have already agreed that they would go into a coalition with him. We don't know if we can completely trust them. Anything could happen after the elections. But he still has the best possibility to reach what Israelis now consider the magic number of a bare majority of 61 parliamentary seats out of 120. The average of all of his parties in the polls over the last campaign cycle has been around 59, creeping up over the 60 seat mark out of 120 seats. If that trend continues, it's not impossible that he would get 61 or even more. That would be a surprise. It would go beyond what we're seeing in the polls, but he does have that block. The problem is that the parties who are running against him, who want to form a coalition that he does not lead, they're not sufficiently united. So at present, the blocks appear to be even. Those other parties, many of them representing the outgoing government, have about 60 seats themselves, but they are not sufficiently united. That's one of the reasons the government fell apart. So it is certainly a possible scenario. He would be going in with the religious Zionism party that you mentioned in your report, which is a very extremist, nationalist, supremacist, theocratic party, and two ultra-Orthodox parties who often sit in Israel's coalition. So that's what the government would look like.
So let's look at that alternative, because while Netanyahu works on his comeback, acting Prime Minister Yair Lapid is doing all that he can to keep Netanyahu out of power. Do you think it's possible Lapid could do that and recreate the surprise he pulled off after the last election?
It's a very uphill battle. Again, because the number of seats they have at 60, or if they're lucky, 61, includes parties that they either don't want to go in or won't be invited in. And those are primarily the two parties, if they cross the threshold, representing mostly Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel. And there was a great controversy over the United Arab List joining the previous government. The other party, called Hadash Ta'al, probably nobody would invite them in. They have been taking a very hard line against joining a government. And so he wouldn't have an easy path to building a coalition. He would have to pull off some very significant and masterful negotiations in order to prize somebody away from the bloc of parties currently supporting Netanyahu, or even individual members of one of the parties. Likud is certainly the immediate option if there are people who are willing to defect in order to join Yair Lapid-led bloc. The other option is that the other party in that bloc, party of the current outgoing defense minister Benny Gantz, the party is called National Unity. They are claiming that even though they're only polling at around 12 to 13 seats, that they would have a better chance of breaking the Netanyahu bloc and pulling one of the parties over, and that maybe they could form the coalition. Of course, you don't have to be the biggest party in Israel, as we know from the outgoing government. And so all of those scenarios are on the table. There are many permutations of each scenario, and there's a great deal of uncertainty.
So what's the voter turnout likely to be in various parts of Israel, and what are the main issues on voters' minds right now?
Well, voter turnout is a very interesting thing. As your report pointed out, people are fatigued. But from everything we can see in the surveys, overall, voter turnout looks set to be typically high. Israel generally has high voter turnout. Last time it was over 67%. As far as we can see, it will probably be in that range, but the big concern is that the Arab citizens of Israel have been indicating that they will vote at a much lower rate than Jews, which is a typical pattern also in recent years. It could be anywhere as low as the mid to upper 30% range or as high as 50%, but very few predict that it will go above 50%, and that will be a critical distinction. In terms of the issues of the campaign, it's complicated because, of course, Israelis are worried about cost of living, dealing with the price hikes like everybody else in the world, but they don't really distinguish between the parties based on economic themes. It's much more about, in Israel, it's much more in terms of issues. It's about the Israeli Palestinian conflict and security. And we have seen serious escalations over the last number of months. That's very top of mind, including attacks and ongoing raids of Israelis in Palestinian cities and attacks on Israelis. So all of that certainly generally helps the right wing, pushes people to vote for more right wing parties. But I really think that ultimately, at this point, fifth election in less than 4 years, most people are choosing based on which bloc, the Netanyahu supporting bloc or those who are opposed to Netanyahu. They see the same issues, but they just believe whichever side they support will resolve them better.
All right, we'll see what happens. Dahlia Scheindlin, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.